In our reading today from the publication The Century, we are going to read the first person account of a man who fought in the trenches during World War I. Even today, in modern conversational English, we use the expression to be in the trenches with someone or in our personal activity. In this video, I'm not going to explain in detail all that that expression means, but you can get a good idea of that expression, to be in the trenches, to be in the trenches with someone else, from this firsthand experience of this gentleman who was literally in the trenches in World War I. Let's go ahead and begin with paragraph 1. Edward Francis, who was born in 1896, was a private in the British Army throughout World War I, refusing promotion because he believed it would place him in more danger. He fought in most of the major battles of the war. He died in 1996. I had been a Boy Scout, and I used to love marching up and down with the tin drum in front of me. So when young men started enlisting for the war, I thought, well, perhaps it would be a good holiday. I stood in a queue at the Birmingham Town Hall and joined up, and when I got home, my mother said to me, "Have you enlisted as a soldier?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You little fool. Only thieves and vagabonds join the army." And she said, "You go back and tell them you've changed your mind." But of course, I couldn't. The mood among all of us young men was that we couldn't get to be a soldier quick enough. In Birmingham, where I enlisted, they expected to make one battalion, which would be made up of about 1,000 men. But within the first few days of the war, they had 4,500. We had a wonderful time training. I was in a section of about 14 men, all from the same area, all speaking the same language with the same twang, more or less. We were like one big family. And then came the great day for us young ones when they issued us a rifle, the newest Lee Enfield rifle. You should have seen some of the lads looking at it, those who had never held a gun in their life. We went through 8 months of training until we were so itchy to get to France we couldn't stand it. All we were thinking was, we must get to France before the war's over. The men training us were old soldiers of the South African War who were old enough to be my father. None of them had experienced a war when you're in trenches facing each other, with shells coming at you every minute. So we had no idea what it would be like when we got there. We crossed over to France after we finished our training, and we walked 15 miles to our base camp. When it was our turn to go up into the trenches, the regiment coming out had been there almost since the start, and they looked at us as if to say, "Hey, you're smiling now, but you won't be later." We passed 7 days and nights in there. After a rest of 6 or 7 days, we went back in again. Then came the day when someone said to us excitedly, "Jack Smith." I said, "What about him?" I knew Jack Smith. "He's dead. He's been shot." The first one of the battalion to be shot. I said, "What?" And the man replied, "Yes, he's dead. Been shot. He put his head too far over and a sniper got him." And that caused a bit of sensation among the lads. They thought, well, this is not exactly what we came for. And from that day onwards, when we went to the trenches, it was 3 killed, 4 killed, 5 killed, 20 killed, 100 killed. We learned all about the trenches and their risks and what we had to do to fight the Germans. And of course, the morning came and we had to go over the top, which meant you'd leap over the trench and cover 300, 400, 500 yards toward the enemy lines. So when the officers blew their whistle, we were to dash out of the trenches and make our way toward the German trenches. And it was then that we looked at each other and wondered if we'd ever get through it. Some were visibly shaking. Some were crying. Some were almost shell-shocked before they started. But of course, when the whistle went, we had to scramble over. We would only learn what happened afterward. If we took the trench, we went over to capture, then we'd have time to rest and talk. And one would say to the other, "Where's Bill so-and-so?" And someone else would say, "Oh, he got it. He's killed." And then you'd see that your friends of yours or people that you knew were missing. Some were wounded, some were killed. And you could be talking to a man in the trench, and while you're talking, he accidentally looks over the top of it, and that few seconds, he might get it in the head. The German snipers, who were the best in the world, they had the finest rifles with telescopic sights, so just to show your forehead for a few seconds might mean you were dead. We spent a lot of time walking from one trench to the next, and when the weather changed to rain and mud, well, it's almost impossible to describe what that was like. If you've seen pictures of the surface of the moon, it was something like that, only worse, all dug up and wet with mud. Impossible to walk. To get 2 miles would take 7 or 8 hours. Sometimes you were in water up to your waist and had to walk in it for a week to get to the firing line. And under those conditions, they couldn't bring food or water up to us. All the people bringing it were shot down or shelled. So we were hungry and thirsty. When we'd been there about 6 or 8 months, covered in mud, wet practically all day, absolutely chewed up by lice, we used to say, "And to think, we wanted to come to this hole." In our first month there, we could smell the dead bodies. But after a while, we took no notice of it. For a person just arriving there, it would stink. But to us, who were used to it every day, we didn't think a lot of it. The noise was always on. And when you'd been there as long as we were in the trenches, you could almost say for sure if a shell was going to drop by you by the sound it made. If you thought it was going to get you, you'd flatten yourself in the mud, however deep it was. Everywhere you looked, for miles, were great holes full of water and mud. This was dangerous for those who got a small wound, because if they were near a big shell hole, they couldn't get up and they would feel themselves slipping into the hole. Once the water, which was poisoned with gas and God knows what, got into the wound, it was certain death. All the shouting in the world did no good because we couldn't even give them a hand. That would seem the usual thing to do when a man you joined up with, who was a friend and a comrade, was shrieking for help. But we had orders not to help a wounded man. Once on the way out from the front lines, we were walking out in the pitch dark and I heard a chap crying for help in a big shell hole. His hands were scraping the edge and he was crying to everybody passing by for help. Well, I couldn't stand that. So I got my rifle and we pulled and pulled and pulled, and he was saved from drowning, but this was forbidden. Practically everyone had shell shock, but there were 2 kinds, one for the privates and one for the officers. With an officer, at the slightest trembling of the lips, they would be sent to the hospital for a week and then to England to recover. But privates would get a dose of medicine and be sent back onto the line. In the later years of the war, we got used to the dead bodies and treated them as nothing, like pieces of wood. Everything had a use. We'd even put the bodies in the bottom of the trench and stand on them to keep dry. Of course, these bodies were recovered later, but if they were left too long, they became skeletons because the rats chewed at them. To see a body with no face but a skeleton would shock most men. We also searched the dead bodies in the hopes of finding some food on them, or perhaps a flask of water. Some of them had food which had been sent by relatives from England, and that was a godsend, because other than that, we could not have stood up to the conditions we were forced to fight in. Well, that concludes the reading for today. Now you have a mental picture from that description from this first-person account of fighting in the trenches. All right, well, that's where we will end for today in our reading, and I'll see everyone next time.